Warning. The following podcast features views and opinions that are likely to trigger the extreme fanboys and fangirls who disagree with them. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to another edition of Hot Takes with Billy, non-essential business. That's right, still quarantined, but you know what? I don't know if you would even know listening to this show. It's just two people talking. We've been talking a lot in the last couple of weeks about movies from 2008, a lot of superhero movies. I kind of count today's episode as a quasi-superhero movie. We're talking James Bond 007 Quantum of Solace, and here to do that is my friend, Mr. Lon Harris. Lon, welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
Yeah, I think I was on. It might have been one of the first episodes.
Yeah, it's funny. We were like, oh, let's do Quantum of Solace, and I feel like I kept trying to tie it to to the next James Bond movie, and then that just kept being a moving target. So eventually, I was like, you know what, let's just talk about it.
It's an evergreen topic. You can always talk about James Bond. It's comforting that way.
I want to talk a little bit about I think, when we first met, one of the bigger, I'm not going to say arguments, but passionate discussions that we had was around James Bond. And I was never like a huge James Bond fan. I liked the Pierce Brosnan movies because I liked the GoldenEye video game. But you were like, take my box set, borrow it. And I went through all the James Bond movies, and you had a really good comment that it seems like an evolution of the action movie.
Yeah, well, it's like he's tracking, history through the James Bond films. I mean, I think that's what's kind of cool about it is like whatever the era the James Bond movie you're watching is from, it like echoes that era. I mean, Casino Royale is a really famous example of like parkour was in every action movie when that came out. So you've got the scene of him chasing the bomb maker through the construction site. It's all parkour. Like Live and Let Die was like the height of the blaxploitation era. And so it's like, it's James Bond, but in a blaxploitation kind of context. And like, there's lots of those kind of examples. And so it's fun to like go back through and rewatch the series historically, because it does kind of play like, here's the evolution of the modern action movie.
I think that may be why I tend to like some of the goofier ones, because I kind of don't take James Bond as seriously as at sometimes, depending on the iteration, it takes itself. Like, I know that Moonraker is very bottom of the list for most people, but I just find it so ridiculous that it's kind of entertaining to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. There's like, for most of Bond's cinematic history, it's campy, it's silly. Like the Ian Fleming books are pretty serious. Those are pretty grim. And the new Daniel Craig movies are sort of purposefully echoing that, where he's like a very hard character, is like very unfeeling, very cold. The Bond in the books is probably colder than any of our cinematic takes to date. But yeah, other than that, I mean, the Connery movies get very silly by the end. Roger Moore is pretty ridiculous the whole way through. And I mean, even like the Dalton is sort of... I really like the George Lazenby one, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, for this same reason. That it kind of is one of the rare entries to take it a little bit more seriously and try to make it feel more like a espionage movie than like a zany, campy action thing.
So 2006 rolls around, and I think, a lot of times, I talked about this when we talked about Batman Begins, that history is kind of rewritten and things get kind of, distorted, where it was Batman Begins comes out and everyone's like, oh, you took something that had been over the top and campy and you kind of grounded it into a new reality. So James Bond, they must have looked at Batman Begins and they took that formula. It's like, well, no, because Casino Royale came out a year later, which means they had already started working on this well ahead of time. But it is interesting that around this time, the kind of, the thought was, let's take these properties and see if we can ground them a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely like a piece. Like, I don't think people always want to do that. They want to be like, this movie came out this year and then this movie came out 2 years later. And so it was influential. It was a direct line. Like, the filmmakers saw that one movie and were like, let's us do that. And it's almost never actually that. It's always more like these ideas are in the air and a lot of different people are working on a lot of those interpretations all at the same time. Because there's a lot of superhero franchises where, it used to be really zany and now we're going to do this much more sort of grounded, realistic take on it. And I think that was just one of those ideas that was in the air in the aughts. It's also interesting because the Daniel Craig series was really the first time they did a full rethink the whole series reboot in decades, because GoldenEye, the first Brosnan movie, was actually written to be a Timothy Dalton Bond movie, and then just there were legal holdups and they never ended up making it, and they held on to the script, and then when they had a new Bond, they just did the last movie they had written for Dalton. So the Brosnan series was never a ground level rethink of the whole franchise. It was more like a continuation of what they'd been doing in the 80s.
So before we get too far into it, I just want to ask, because I feel like there's two camps of people. Are you one of the people that thinks that this is the same guy for all these adventures, or is James Bond a code name?
I mean, I don't it's definitely not the same guy. That's crazy and ridiculous. And the Craig movies really put the nail in that coffin as far as I'm concerned, because we see him starting out, getting his 00 status. So he can't be the same guy that got married in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Where does that fit into this timeline? It's definitely not the same. And also I don't like that violates the history, he can't be the same guy now who was already adventuring in the 1960s. The timeline doesn't make sense. So, no, I like the idea. If you need to have that kind of franchise consistency, if you're that kind of person and you can't just accept that every time we get a new Bond, it sort of resets, the chronology kind of resets, then yeah, I think you could just say 007 is a designation, and we know that's how it works. There are other 00s, and then when one of them leaves or retires or dies, another person fills in and becomes the new 008, and we're going to see it in the next one. Lashana Lynch is, she's going to be 007 because Bond retired at the end of Spectre. So, yeah, I think that makes sense, and that's fine, and that satisfies the need to feel like it's all happening in one consistent universe. Sure.
So, 2006, Casino Royale comes out,
yes.
and it's very successful, both critically and commercially. Everyone seems to really enjoy this new take on Bond, and like all fandom does, lowercase fandom, they were unsure about Craig with the casting. Then he comes out, and it's kind of like Christian Bale, where it's this is the only version of this. So when Quantum of Solace was announced, I think all of us were like, that's a strange title, but sure, you've won the goodwill. I will go and see this movie. I remember 2008 was just such a murderer's row lineup of huge blockbusters, and this came out towards the end of the year. And I remember I didn't have a chance to rewatch Casino Royale before I saw this, and I went opening night to Quantum of Solace, and as I left, I was like, I have kind of no idea what just happened. I think I liked it, but I don't know what the plot was.
Yeah, it definitely ties right into Casino Royale. I mean, it's the first time they've done that. It's the first time they've been we're going to treat these movies with this same actor playing James Bond as one ongoing story. I love that conceptually. I like the idea of doing that. I don't really feel like they've done a very good job with it. As much as I like a lot of the individual Craig movies as Bond movies, I don't think they've actually brought the storyline through all the movies in a way that's interesting and consistent and feels like one story. It feels like they're constantly just trying to backtrack and invent ways to bring it all together. And I think that the problems start in Quantum of Solace, which feels way too much like a continuation of Casino Royale than its own movie. And it shouldn't be like that. I don't mind narrative things that you pull through all the movies, but each one should feel like its own adventure. And Solace, he doesn't really even have a mission. He's just find out more about what happened to Vesper at the end of Casino Royale.
I guess it's funny because, I rewatched these Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace last weekend, and my wife watched with me, and it was the first time she had seen either of them. And I I understood everything so much more this time, and she was really into it too. But I just realized, and I think this is a valid criticism. I like this movie. I never said it was my favorite. There's this incorrect rumor that I said this is my favorite Bond or even Craig Bond. It's not. I just don't think it's like as terrible as like Spectre.
Spectre's a lot better. Like
Die Another Day.
Spectre has a lot of problems. We can get into this. Spectre's a lot better than Quantum of Solace overall. Taken overall as a Bond movie.
But I will concede to the criticism that this is essentially an extended fourth act tack on to Casino Royale. I think there's a lot of cool things in this movie, but as a story, it's like I said, I hadn't watched Casino Royale when I saw this in theaters, and I was like, I don't remember who that guy is. I kind of don't remember. I remember that guy got turned in in the middle of the last movie. Why is he a good guy now? Like it flowed a lot better this time. But yeah, it's interesting because to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, I'm not the Bond aficionado, but this is the only direct sequel to a Bond movie, right?
Yes, there's sort of all of the movies in Craig except for Skyfall, which was purposefully like they didn't do Skyfall as a continuation of this, and then Spectre kind of retconned Skyfall back into the chronology.
I mean, they retconned all of this where it was like Quantum was a subsidiary of an even bigger thing.
This is what I mean. Like, just call it Spectre in Quantum of Solace. I think they just did that because there's an Ian Fleming Bond short story called Quantum of Solace. And I think they wanted to use that title, and their excuse, because it doesn't make sense, was, we'll call the evil organization Quantum. But that really screws them, because when they want to introduce Spectre, now they have to be like, what, is there another evil? Like, so this evil organization is a subsidiary of that evil global corporation? Like, it's just stupid. And it doesn't make it any cooler. Like, that's...
And it's, I'm sure Spectre is just a subsidiary of Disney, ultimately.
Yeah, right, of Globochem or whatever. Like, it doesn't make Spectre cooler that it had this other organization that we barely got to know anything about called Quantum underneath it. I don't know why they seem to keep thinking that is going to somehow make people be like, oh, cool, it was all being controlled by this guy. But really, it was all being controlled by this guy. And it's just like... it just feels like it kind of defeats its own purpose after a while.
I do think, so let's get into Quantum of Solace. I found out the first time that we had this discussion about Quantum of Solace, you have a borderline irrational hate for director Mark Forster. Can you shed a little bit of light on this?
Irrational would be if I was like, I hate him as a person. Like, I don't hate him. I have no animosity towards Mark Forster. He might be a lovely man. I've never met him. I really don't know anything. I really don't even know what he looks like. I don't know anything about him. I really don't like his films. And I have rational reasons, I think, for why I don't like all of his films. I feel like he's one of these guys that he makes movies that like you expect them. He's doing things that we've seen in other movies. He's ripping little things off from other filmmakers, and there's never anything like unique or inspired or interesting about his films. It's always like what you'd sort of expect, but not done that well. Like pulled off okay. Like World War Z is a great example. Like there's nothing we haven't seen in zombie movies a bunch of times in World War Z, and it's also sort of It's awkwardly put together. Like it's kind of a half-assed story that doesn't really go anywhere, and it's very like episodic and it's sort of flat. And so even in the moments when it does something cool, like the zombies making an anthill with like a visual that's a little bit different, it's like this momentary thing, and you're like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then you go back to this sort of turgid, flat storytelling. And I just feel like it's always that with him over and over again. And Quantum of Solace is a great example too. Like, he's doing this Paul Greengrass Bourne movie stuff the whole time. He's basically trying to do a Bond Bourne movie. And it's all action, and it's that shaky cam, fast edit, like you see blurry, like a car, and then this car, and then that car, and you have no idea where anybody is or what's going on. It's all just like frenetic and fast motion. And, so it's just unsatisfying to me on some level. And I don't know, he gets a lot of praise. I've never seen a movie of his and thought, oh, that was good. I like that. It's always like, it's like underwhelming. Finding Neverland is another one where it's just like people loved it. And it's like, I couldn't connect to it at all. Like, was I not supposed to be thinking the whole time that J.M. Barrie's kind of a creep? Because I was.
Christopher Robin, you didn't like the poo?
Oh, I didn't even see that. Like, I've gotten to the point now where I get that he's not on my level. Like, Monsters Ball, like, I went out to see that theatrically because it was getting these amazing reviews, and Halle Berry was getting Oscar talk, and it was like this heralded movie, and then I really didn't like it, and that was where it all started. That was where the trouble began.
So I do think it's unfortunate because I do think that this movie is so connected to Casino Royale that you're right. It's kind of hard to stand on its own as a singular adventure because really he's just uncovering the mystery that was kind of dropped at the end of the last one. But I do think that there are a lot of cool things in it. Like, I really do love that. It's not necessarily the opening scene, but it's like one of the, in the first act when he goes and he kind of chases that guy in the hotel room and it ends up in that
through
foot
Siena,
chase.
Italy. Yeah.
Right. I all that stuff. I'm like, that's like good Bond action. Like, there is good Bond action in this.
There are some cool sequences for sure. I like the chase through Italy. I like the decision to go to Haiti, which this is the very first Bond film that's ever been shot in Haiti, and like what a cool, like interesting location. And I love the in Austria the opera sequence, like when he's spying on the members of Quantum, and he like tricks them into standing up so he could figure out who everybody is, and he's talking to him on the receiver. And I love the design of the Bolivian hotel at the end. That like
that hotel is one of the coolest
Perla
set
de
pieces.
las Dunas. Like, that's a very cool villain lair setting for a Bond movie. I feel like it kind of like, why would you design a lair that's so easy for someone to blow up? Like, you just there's these tanks in your hotel that if I shoot them, one bullet causes the entire hotel to like vaporize. Like, that's a horrible design flaw, but it is a cool looking location. So no, I'm not here to say there's nothing cool in this movie.
Is that hotel meant for like general use, or is it like only for like world changing deals like that?
I realize now that we're talking about it out loud that I don't think there's a reason to think this based on the movie, but my assumption was always that he built that, like that is Dominic Green's hotel because he's doing this property, he needs to be in this area of Bolivia, so he's built this luxury property just for himself and his guests. But that's just me having watched other Bond movies and assuming the villain has their own lair. Maybe he just found this cool place, I don't know.
Just like, what a terrible vacation. Like, you literally are just going there for the hotel if that's the case.
If you have to leave the hotel and you don't have a ride, you die. Like, literally he dies trying to walk away from the hotel to any other place. It's impossible.
I think, it's there are a lot of action sequences that I like, but I do feel I'll readily admit it does feel like they had about 10 cool ideas for action sequences, and it somewhat plays more like vignettes than it does like the action feels organic. I think specifically for me, the one that like doesn't connect to me and definitely feels like, okay, they just needed an action beat was when they're in the plane.
Yes, the plane, like, he needs to be in the air to go. He's gonna drop grenades on Carol Baskin's property. Like, what's that sequence about? Yeah, it's very flimsy. The boat chase is also very flimsy. Wait, like, why is he even like? He's a good guy. She's very beautiful, but like, why does he even go save Camille Montes? He doesn't even know who she is at that point. We in the audience don't even know who she is at that point. That whole storyline connecting to his in like the flimsiest way possible is like a real issue with the movie. I think they never really figured out a way to get these two to like work together. They just kind of start working together.
Yeah, the introduction, I had to rewind it because I actually I was very confused. It's like Dominic hires someone that Bond ends up killing to kill Camille, and then when she's like, "You tried to kill me," he's like, "Yeah, well, it happens anyway." Like, it's very
right. Bond shows up in in Port-au-Prince posing as a hitman who's been hired to kill Camille.
Right.
And then he sees the general that Green has now tasked with killing her, is about to kill her. So then he goes to stop her from being killed, even though he's there to follow Green, not her. It's very strange. That whole sequence just feels like, we got to get this plot out. We got to get you to the next phase of this investigation, and it's just done in this very clunky way. Like, Green is just at this harbor having like 8 different conversations about everything that's going on in his life. And it's like, I don't really feel like this is what a world industrialist would do.
I do really like the character of Camille. I actually think she's more interesting than Bond in this particular movie. Like, I would have liked another movie of just her.
Yeah, I mean, she's got motivation that he doesn't really have. Like, he's upset about Vesper. He wants to figure out what's going on in this organization. But it's not great in terms of the only thing driving him for the entire movie. It's a little slack, whereas she's got this, revenge, this very like telenovela over the top revenge where he burned her house down and killed her whole family, and she's, got burn scars because of this trauma. So yeah, that's not bad. It just doesn't really connect. And I mean, I don't know if Bolivia has a very elite secret service. Maybe they do. I'm not here to dump on Bolivia. But the idea, everybody in the movie keeps saying Bolivian secret service as if that's a thing I'm supposed to know about. Like, oh, not the Bolivian secret service. They're the biggest badasses in the world. Like, are they? I've never heard of the Bolivian Secret Service.
I mean, they're doing a terrible job of preventing a coup, if that's the case.
They're definitely not stopping this general from losing all of the country's water to a Frenchman. They're not on that at all.
By the way, I don't know if you actually watched this again in preparation or just kind of skimmed around.
I saw it not long ago because there's a Screen Junkies project that I worked on that involved this. So I saw it about a month ago.
I was surprised. I was like, is that? Yeah, that's David Harbour.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
A rare David Harbour sighting pre-Stranger Things.
He plays a lot of like kind of scummy government types. There's like 4 or 5 classic David Harbour, like he's like a sleaze bag who works at the Justice Department type roles.
I kind of liked that little side plot. I think, if I'm misremembering this, I apologize, but I think Felix Leiter, they actually wanted to have like a slightly bigger role, but with the writer's strike and on-set rewrites, it kind of got a little bit derailed a little bit, but he does get a little bit of screen time. And
yeah, I think you could tell in like the second and third act, like he shows up for just like a beat, and it's like obvious if you were going to write Jeffrey Wright into the movie and bring this character back, he'd have some bigger payoff. But it is cool to see him. I really like Jeffrey Wright in this role. I'm really glad he's coming back for No Time to Die.
I'm just looking right now, and in 2011, this must have been pre-Skyfall press. Craig was talking about how the writer's strike kind of impacted this movie. He said we had the bare bones of a script, then there was a writer's strike, and there was nothing we could do. So himself and Forster were kind of the ones that were trying to move things around. And I just wonder, do you think that Quantum of Solace maybe would have been better received had that strike never happened? Or do you think this movie was what it was going to be no matter what?
Oh, no, for sure. I mean, I think it probably would have had, you could tell it's messy. Like it probably would have had another pass or two from like a pro who would make this stuff flow a little better, come up with some better connections between some of these stuff. Like there's a lot of just stuff that feels like half done or rushed, or like other Bond movies would have like tightened the corners a little bit. Like Gemma Arterton as Miss Fields also. It's like she's there for a beat. It's this really kind of dumb throwback, like she shows up and she's like, I'm not going to sleep with you, Mr. Bond, and then you cut to them having slept together, and then she's dead. And it's like very weird and abrupt, and it's a very brutal send-off for this character that was like cute and that we just met for a moment. And I feel like there were probably gonna be some fill-in material in there to make her feel like that feel like more of a real character.
The one thing I did like about that thing, because I'm with you that it does feel very like, whoa, that was quick. But I do like that.
It's so cold, like Solange gets killed in Casino Royale, and it's really like cold, but it doesn't feel abrupt. It feels like that's the moment, like that's right. The stakes.
I do like that M does kind of get on him for that. Like, this girl wasn't even supposed to do this. Like, you are this instrument of death, and you kind of don't even care. Like, I do feel like, and maybe it's because I literally watched them like all in the same afternoon. Like, it did feel like a slightly different James Bond in Quantum of Solace than it did in Casino Royale. So I do feel like the coldness of Bond does hit a little bit in this one. I'll give it that.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, the idea of she's drowned in oil to echo the Goldfinger, like covered in gold. Like, I don't mind little winking callbacks and stuff like that. Although I do think there's like an oil motif in this movie, because the idea is that Green is lying to everybody. Like, he wants everybody to think that he wants this land in Bolivia for oil, but it's actually for water. But it doesn't make sense for him to drown somebody in oil, because he doesn't have oil.
Right.
Like, she should have been drowned in water. It's just not as good a visual. So it's like one of those, like, well, we have to cover it oil because visually it'll look cool and it'll be like in Goldfinger. But it does, like, from Green's perspective, it doesn't make any actual sense.
Unless he's just trying to throw them off. But if that's the case, then why bother leaving a calling card?
Yeah, you think I am after the oil, but it is just water, and I will tell you by drowning this girl in oil. Like, it's really elaborate and silly for no good reason. Like, it's really, his thought process behind that doesn't make a lot of sense.
You know what? That's fair. I'm not even.
Thanks. And then later they get revenge on him by making him drink a can of oil. It's like, guys, oil's not even a thing. That's not even in this story. You're thinking of world is not enough.
Also, I didn't know that oil came in like Pepsi cans.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's so weird and dumb. I really don't like that. The like, we found him with motor oil in his stomach. Like, I don't know. That's another question. Is no matter how thirsty you got, would there be a point where you would try drinking motor oil?
It's funny because I used to watch like those like I Survived shows, and it's like, yeah, people just do stupid things when they're when they're at the end.
That when you have Bear Grylls on as your guest, that's one to ask him. What he thinks.
Going back a little bit to Camille, I think one thing that I do really enjoy about her as a quote unquote Bond girl is that she does have her own story, which I feel like a lot of times the Bond girls don't really have, and thus it's kind of nice to see Daniel Craig's Bond, like at the end, like he tries to go for that Bond kiss, and it just feels so weird because she's like, yeah, I'm not really into this.
Yeah, she's not there to be his like accessory, and I like Spectre. I think there's more good stuff in that movie than bad. But one thing that does bother me about Spectre is that they didn't figure out a way for Madeline Swan, like, she doesn't have any real reason to be there. She's just there as kind of an accessory for Bond. He needs a beautiful lady with him, and so he's got one. She's Mr. White's daughter, but she only makes sense there in relation to the men in her life. She doesn't have any motivation. She just decides, like, oh, you know what? For my dad that I didn't even know and like and was estranged from, we're going to do this for him. And it's like, that feels very clunky. But yeah, you're right. Camille Montes, she's got a real driving motivation to maybe not be there with Bond, but at least be there for the story to happen. I don't feel like it's a great, like, obviously Olga Kurylenko, very, very beautiful, looks the part of a Bond girl. I don't think it's her fault. It's a very underwritten role. It's not a great performance. Like, I don't think she's got a lot of charisma as this character. I just think it's kind of an interesting take on a Bond girl. But she doesn't have any chemistry with Craig.
She doesn't. She does not.
And no. I don't really think she's super believable as like this elite Bolivian Secret Service agent or spy or whatever she's supposed to be. It feels like one of those times when a model gets a big part in a movie and you're like, all right, we're going to go with this. Brooklyn Decker, you do your thing.
I think it's tough because I don't know if it's like legitimately no chemistry or if it's because the chemistry with Eva Green was so intensely like believable and real that everything kind of pales in comparison since then.
I mean, sure. I mean, I think you can look back on the like Bond girl history of these movies, and like it, you know, sometimes it clicks, sometimes it doesn't. Like they're not hiring these Bond girls, I don't think, with a real eye for who's going to have tons of chemistry with the dude playing Bond. I think it's like who's the it woman of the moment, who's like the big actress we want to have in this movie. And so, you know, sometimes you get lucky. I feel like Ana de Armas is a great choice. Like I think she's probably going to be really good. But you know, it's kind of luck of the draw. Like you'll see what you get. And sometimes it works, and boy, sometimes it really does not.
Sometimes you get Christmas.
Yeah, Dr. Christmas Jones, sure. Oh. But I mean, like sometimes there's like, you know, like it seems to all make sense, and then there's just like Barbara Bach in The Spy Who Loved Me. Like great casting. She's very beautiful. It's like a cool character where she's like the Soviet James Bond, like she's like their version of 007, and it's just like they just don't really connect, you know, like they just don't have, they're not magic on screen together, her and Roger Moore. What can you do?
You know, I mentioned briefly before that I was confused about one character that now watching them side to side, I'm like, oh yeah, this makes total sense. I actually thought one of like the underrated performances and characters was Mathis. Who my Bond memory is fuzzy at best because I watched all of them in like a 2-week span 3 years ago. But that character, I know he's in the books, but is he in the other Bond movies?
I don't think Rene Mathis is in the other. I can't think of a movie that he's been in before the Craigs. I mean, I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. You're right. I know that he is in the stories.
Right. I really love.
I'm looking online. Yeah, no. The Casino Royale is the first time he's been on screen.
I really loved that character in Casino Royale, and I was bummed that he got carted out. So I was happy to see him again in this one, and I do think that he does provide like some emotional moments in otherwise movie where some of the other emotional moments don't quite hit, but I feel like his do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to butcher his name, the Italian actor, Marcello, I'm sorry. Anyway,
Matteo, I don't know.
No, that's Giancarlo Giannini. There you go.
Yes, there you go.
He's great. He really sells it. I mean, I think it's got a little bit of the same motivation problem, which is like, there's no way this guy would give up his cushy retirement with his wife at this villa to go like potentially get murdered on this crazy dangerous mission with this guy who the last time they worked together turned him into the authorities and thought he betrayed him. Like, of course you wouldn't team back up with that guy. This is sort of ludicrous. So you have to kind of set that aside. But I'm still glad. I like the idea of going back to him and bringing him along. It is, again, this movie is just so like harsh and cold and brutal. Like, it's really brutal how he goes out and then he gets dumped in a dumpster. Bond's like, he wouldn't mind. Like, he might mind. Like, his wife's not even gonna know what happened to him. Like, this is awful.
I mean, I guess that just goes to like how cut off Bond is at that point, but that was the part that even my wife was like, damn, like she's like, please don't throw me in a dumpster.
There's a few moments like that too, because there's also after the boat chase when Camille's knocked out, he just walks up to the hotel and just dumps her in some dude's arms. They're like, there you go, drop her off, and then he leaves. Like, dude, what? At least put her down a couch or something. Like, rest her head on something. Like, what are you doing? Like a monster. You're the hero of these movies. That is, I mean, to be fair, that is more like book James Bond. Like, he's just it's for Queen and country, and he's just about the mission.
You know, it's always bugged me about James Bond that he doesn't seem to me to be the greatest spy, because it's just like everyone knows his name, he'll tell you, and he will blow things up and just cause carnage in the middle of the streets. Like, he's not a spy. He's just kind of like a a mercenary, and at least in this movie especially.
I mean, it sort of runs through. I mean, I think that we're just looking at the difference between like an Ian Fleming Cold War era operative and like what the job was. Like, obviously, this is a really silly, overblown version of what that job ever was in reality.
Sure.
But I think all of our modern context for espionage and spy movies is more trying to be like, have that added realism of like, well, you'd use surveillance technology and it would be like informants and a network of people, and you'd have like undercover people, you know, like all the things that we know from cop shows and movies and spy movies and whatever. And I think, yeah, Bond is this very fanciful idea of, it's basically who's the next person who has the piece of information I need, and then I'm going to punch it out of them or it out of them. And like, that's it. Those are the only two real weapons in his arsenal, you know? Like, he's going to punch or shoot you, or he's going to try to have sex with you and seduce you. And that's how he's going to find out what he needs to know.
He's either going to use his PP7 or just his PP. You don't know.
Nice. There you go. But yeah, but like, I mean, I don't know. I think that's kind of what makes it comfort food in a way. Like, it isn't like a Bourne movie or like Spy Game or something where it's like really trying to play out these scenarios like Jack Ryan would, you know, like, well, here's the statecraft of it, and here's what the president would do, and here's what you know, like, it's just in this other alternate reality where, you know, you could just be a badass and then look good in a tuxedo and, you know, seduce the beautiful woman and win the big shootout and save the day, you know?
I think,
the fabulous part of the appeal, I think.
Well, when I think about like the Bond movies that I really do like, and maybe it's just because like the first Bond movie I ever saw was Tomorrow Never Dies. So like I was like a Pierce Brosnan era, you know, Bond fan.
No, me too. GoldenEye was definitely the first Bond movie I saw in a theater and was like, oh, this is cool. I liked it. Like, he was my first Bond as well.
Like, the only thing that kind of bums me out about both Quantum and Casino Royale to a slightly lesser extent is I do like the slight ridiculousness of the technology and the gadgets, and these ones are kind of devoid of them.
Well, yeah, Quantum doesn't have gadgets at all. There's no cue, because that's what I mean. Like, that's one of the things that bugs me about it is I get that you want to continue from Casino Royale and carry the story on, but you still need like him going to M and getting an assignment and going to Q and getting his gear. Like, that's just part of it. Like, it feels like an action movie with Daniel Craig more than a James Bond movie in a lot of ways. Yeah, I agree. Like, you want the gadgets and the spycraft. That's part of it.
The scene at the very end of this movie. So look, if you wanted to erase Quantum of Solace as if it never ever happened, sure. But I think the scene from the very end of this movie when he shows up, and it's Vespers, you know, it's that agent or whoever he is that's seducing these women and gets them kind of sucked into the quantum thing. I really love that scene. I think it ends on such like a melancholy kind of note, and it wraps that story up in like a really nice, tragic way for me. It's almost like if you just couldn't bear to watch Quantum of Solace, I'd almost think like take that scene out and pluck it at the end of Casino Royale, and I feel like you have a pretty good ending to that kind of story.
Yeah, I mean, you could have done everything cool and worthwhile about Quantum of Solace as like a 10-minute epilogue to Casino Royale, and then get on with Skyfall, which feels like the next like legit standalone Bond adventure. Totally.
Yeah, you know, the more I think about it, the more, because this also is like, you know, Bond movies, they're not like, you know, Michael Bay length of films, but they tend to be on the longer side. But this one, it definitely feels like they're just like, yeah, we're just going to wrap up that story real quick before we even think about moving on to anything else in this new Bond landscape. Because it's short for a Bond movie.
Yeah, it's like an hour 45 or something, right?
Yeah, it's a scant for Bond, like 110 minutes.
That's kind of what I mean. It feels like an also ran. It's just like, that's just sort of its place in the franchise, is like, it's just kind of like, oh, and yeah, also there was Quantum of Solace.
Now, one thing that
we haven't talked about, there's one more element that like very tossed off thing about this movie.
Oh, please.
one of the coolest elements of Bond movies, one of the things that's always a way for these movies to work within the formula but add a little taste of their own personality, are the henchmen. Like, the bad guy's always got his, like, evil number one who Bond at some point is going to have to kill. And in this movie, it's a guy with a bowl cut named Elvis. You remember this character? He's a totally forgettable character. It's like the lamest henchman in Bond movie history. Literally, the only thing that stands out about him is his name is Elvis, and he has a bowl cut, and he dies in that hotel in a fireball while Bond's not even there. Like, Bond has nothing to do with his death. He dies just as in the background.
Oh, I mean, this probably doesn't bode well for my defense, but it's like, I just watched this last weekend, and I'm
right,
like,
and you don't even
who?
remember him.
Yeah.
And like, that's right. That's a role. Like, that's Odd Job. That's Jaws. Like, some of the most memorable, cool characters in the history of Bond are these roles. And then it's just like, they don't even bother to try to come up with like a cool bit for the guy. Literally bowl cut. That's what
I'm literally looking at photos of him right now. Is like, I don't remember him being in this movie at all.
Yeah, exactly. This is the problem. Like, think about like GoldenEye, where you've got Natalia Simonova as like, she's like the badass. You know, compare those two characters.
Oh, yeah, Famke Jensen's.
Yeah,
like,
right. I'm sorry, Natalia Simonova. That's Isabella Scorpio. It's right. It's Xenia Onatopp. There you go. Like, that's this character in that movie. Like, think about how much more inspired the Famke Janssen version of that is than Elvis, the bowl cut guy who gets blown up as a like an accident.
Oof. Yeah. How did I miss this bowl cut, man?
Because it's so stupid. It is. One other thing I like that Quantum of Solace adds to the franchise as a whole is it introduced Rory Kinnear as Bill Tanner, who's he's now stayed with the franchise like since then. And I like the Bill Tanner character who hadn't been in the franchise for a while, since World Is Not Enough.
You know, it's funny is looking at these photos of Elvis and the one in the opera scene. I forgot to say, when the opera scene came on, I guess in my mind, I had just completely forgot that this was in this movie, because I just thought that, I was like, wait a second. I just now associate the opera with Rogue Nation so much that I completely forgot that. I guess that's my thing with James Bond. And maybe like if Mission Impossible hadn't turned that corner, what was it, with maybe Mission Impossible 3, 4, somewhere around there.
I feel like, 3 I really like, but I feel like it's Ghost Protocol is the first like modern Mission Impossible movie. Like,
I think if that franchise hadn't turned such a huge corner, I guess that's what, like, when I talk about like James Bond's not a good spy, Mission Impossible does such a great job now of filling that need of like, there are goofy gadgets and everything, but still like they're still like undercover and trying to pull all these little missions, where James Bond just like doesn't even try. Maybe that just boils down to a matter of taste.
Yeah, I think, look, Mission Impossible is taking a lot of cues from James Bond and kind of doing its own fun thing with it. I feel like they're different enough franchises. Like, to me, Mission Impossible almost feels like it sits at the midpoint between James Bond and Fast and Furious. Like, the crazy, over-the-top, tentpole, action, which to me, like Bond movies, they always have a lot of like cool action scenes, but it's really not since the 70s that we think of them as like the biggest blockbuster action movies. Like, they're really more about the character and the vibe and the aesthetic and the globe trotting and the sexiness. And like, I think there's a lot more to James Bond than just, this is going to be like the most mind-blowing, crazy stunt action spectacle. That's kind of where like Mission Impossible, I think, has sort of taken over. Like I said, I like the formula. I like the vibe of James Bond movies. And I think when they work well, there's a lot of room for like really fun creativity within the reliable format that we've used. And like, that's where, it's just really different from Mission Impossible. And Mission Impossible also, like, it's also got that heist element that Bond doesn't necessarily always have. It's also got like an Ocean's 11 sort of vibe to it. So, I mean, I think I love Mission Impossible, but it's almost like a pastiche of like every other big action franchise.
It's also tough because it's like, yeah, even though it's on the verge of insane and Fast and Furious, the fact that Tom Cruise is doing that stuff makes a difference, where it's like Daniel Craig ain't doing this stuff anymore.
Sure.
Like,
but the logic of the Mission Impossible series at this point is basically where the Fast and Furious franchise is. Like that bit in Fallout where they like pose as Wolf Blitzer and make the guy believe that he's watching like CNN.
I love that so much.
It's great. I love it too, but that's as dumb as anything in like Furious 7. Like, come on. That's Brian sneaking into prison in Los Angeles levels of crazy.
Yeah, maybe, I think I feel like such a hypocrite because I say like, yeah, maybe that's what James Bond's missing. But I feel like with Spectre, they started to go back to, I feel like they started to try to get a little bit back to some of those like 60s, 70s Bond things. And it just didn't translate for today. Or maybe it was just like if they had started fresh with a new Bond and went back to that approach, it'd be different. But it just felt like such a reversal of like, what Casino Royale and this movie did to kind of build that Bond character. I don't know how you go from like dumping the body into the trash can and dropping the necklace in the snow to like screwing a guy's wife after she had just come home from the funeral. It was weird, man.
Yeah, I mean, Spectre, like, I like this. I like a lot of the opening stuff in Spectre. And I love the very first scene, like the pre-credit scene in Mexico City is amazing. Like it's one of the best openers maybe in any Bond, definitely in the Craigs. I don't know, but yeah, I think it falls apart in the third act. It's really, once you get to that, they just didn't have a cool way to bring Blofeld in, and they tried to do, somebody's going to write like a book about this one day. Like they tried to do this thing that a lot of modern movies do. It's like the Star Trek Into Darkness thing of like, we want to bring a classic villain into the movie, but we don't want to tell you that we're doing this classic villain. So we're going to like give him a fake name and like pretend that it's not that villain, even though everybody knows that that's what we're doing. Like how they did Khan, Benedict Cumberbatch's Khan. And it's sort of what they did. I mean, like, I guess it worked. Like, it's like sort of the Mandarin thing, too. And it's like we keep trying to do this, and it's never satisfying. Like, it never works right, where then they reveal the name, and everybody goes, oh! It's like we all either knew or you were a member of the audience that didn't care anyway, and so it doesn't have the impact. It's kind of like Mysterio also, although I guess, like, again, they had like a little bit of a clever take on it. But
Did I tell you that I completely spoiled, I guess, that notion for my mother-in-law? We were watching a commercial for Far From Home, and I was like, man, I can't wait to see Jake Gyllenhaal do Mysterio. He's one of my favorite Spider-Man villains. And she's like, he's the bad guy? I was like, oh, there are still some of you out there.
Right, but the people that they fool are the people who aren't invested in the franchise at all, who are just going to, like, show up and, like, great, okay, satisfy those people, but you also want to try to satisfy the people who actually are emotionally invested in the story that you're telling. And, like, yeah, it's just, there's something really uninteresting about being like, oh, that guy? Oh, that's not Blofeld, that's Hans Oberhauser. And then, like, halfway through the movie, you're like, no, his real name is Blofeld. Like, just tell me he's Blofeld. It's pretty obvious that Christoph Waltz is going to be Blofeld anyway. And like that whole thing with the hitchhike, the mountain climbing accident, and Bond's parents and being adopted, and Dad always liked you best, and all that stuff. Like, what a load of ridiculous. Like, we don't need. It's just totally unnecessary. Like, give him an evil plan. That's why he's fighting James Bond. They don't have to have this bizarre family connection going back decades that Bond never knew about anyway.
I guess that's why, that movie to me just spirals a little bit too far out of control for me. Whereas Quantum of Solace, it's like, maybe it's not the most satisfying, or it's definitely not a single serving Bond, but at least it's not obtrusively out of the way. Like, what is happening here? Like, it closes the loop. Maybe it takes its sweet time and suffers from just being an extended fourth act, but at least it's like, okay, we're not going now down this crazy rabbit hole of, like adoption and you knew me from my childhood and just like, what are we doing here?
That's only really a few scenes of Spectre. Like, they stand out because they're so clunky and weird. And then it's got that Dark Knight finish where he's like, you can either save your girl or the mission, Like, it's just like, who cares? What are you, the Riddler now? Like, this is not interesting to me. But I'd rather have that, like a pretty solid Bond entry that kind of falls apart at the end, than Quantum of Solace, which is just, it's just trying to be an action movie. It doesn't really feel like a Bond movie. It's just like this relentless, from here to here to here, set piece, and they're kind of half put together, and they're not even that good as set pieces. Like, the hotel shootout should be way cooler than it is. And like a lot of scenes are just marred by him doing that, like mid-aughts shaky cam thing where I guess we're supposed to be fooled into thinking it's a great action scene because everything's moving so fast and jerking around, but you can't really tell who's where and what's going on. And so it's sort of naturally uninteresting.
I really like the hotel. I really like that opening chase. I think the only set piece that I'm just like, all right, was the plane, because by that point I was like, what are we doing?
The boat chase kind of sucks. The
boat chase, yeah, you're right. The
car chase opening kind of sucks. The fight in the hotel is pretty bad. You're just like, we don't know enough about the layout of the hotel to know who's where and what's going on.
I just like the imagery, I think, is just like,
the hotel itself, the design of it, everything is very cool. I agree.
Now, there's one thing about Quantum of Solace that I will not argue anyone when they say it's horrible, is that that James Bond opening song, Another Way to Die, is
the Jack White one,
maybe the worst Bond song.
Jack White and Alicia Keys. I don't know if it's overall worse, but it so clashes with Bond and the Bond style opening sequence, and it's way too American. Like, James Bond is not an American, so why is this like bluesy, like Black Crowes number at the beginning of a Bond movie? It just like, it feels like Bond's like redneck cousin would have this as his theme song, right? Like, it just doesn't fit the theme at all.
It's just so like, it feels and sounds so raw and unfinished, and then you get to something like Skyfall, which just has like the panache of a Bond song. This one just feels like stripped down,
Yeah, they're like ballads and torch songs. It's like Shirley Bassey. Like, we all know what a Bond movie song is when you hear it. I really like the Billie Eilish No Time to Die one. Like, that feels like a Bond song. It's got that familiar, like, orchestration or whatever. Yeah, it doesn't feel like a guy in his garage, like, picking out a blues song, which is what the Jack White one sounds like. It's just really out of place. I don't know if it's, like, the worst. There are some really annoying Bond songs.
What's like give me, like, your top 3 favorite and bottom 3.
Oh, let me see. I think I have a list. Even.
Of course you made a list.
There's one, which is it? I'll look up which one this is from. There's one called All Time High by Rita Coolidge that I really hate. It's just an annoying song. Yeah, there it is. All Time High from Octopussy. And it's just like, it's trying to be like a Goldfinger type song, but it's just like, can't pull it off at all. I'll tell you, like, one of my favorites, we already talked about Spy Who Loved Me, is that one's got Nobody Does It Better by Carly Simon.
Yeah.
That one's great. I mean, obviously Live and Let Die, I think you got to put near the top. You Only Live Twice, also. Nancy Sinatra, one of the all-time best. And You Only Live Twice appears in Mad Men, one of, like, the coolest transitions in Mad Men history. Don Draper walks in a Good Luck bar, which is right up the street from me here on Sunset, which is like this sort of, like a Japanese theme, like really cheesy throwback Asian themed bar, right as the opening strings of You Only Live Twice come up, which is really cool. Yeah, For Your Eyes Only has that Sheena Easton song, like, that one's pretty bad. Oh, I know, the Sheryl Crow one.
Oh,
what?
Tomorrow Never Dies. Yeah.
Sheryl Crow is such the wrong choice for Bond. It's like, of course that's not gonna. Anybody who's too American is the theme. Like, it's got to sound believably like British people are singing this.
I really liked I don't know if it was Garbage or just Shirley Manson, but the one she did was pretty good.
Yeah, For the World Is Not Enough. I believe that is Garbage. I think that's all of them together.
Speaking of Garbage, I think maybe the worst one, if not Quantum of Solace, has to be Madonna's. I really hate that one.
That's not a good song at all. Two more that I really like. Thunderball, which Tom Jones reportedly, the rumor is that he passed out while belting out that final note. He went for it so much, because the guy like, it's a thunderball, like he really goes for it. And I do love Duran Duran's View to a Kill, a terrible Bond movie, but a pretty solid Bond song.
I really enjoy You Know My Name from Casino Royale.
Oh yeah, that one's great, the Chris Cornell one. Yeah,
and I like Tina Turner's GoldenEye.
Yeah, well, I mean, Adele, Skyfall we mentioned,
right,
which is like a total classic, really great.
I still haven't heard the Billie Eilish one, and I could, for the life of you, could put a gun to my head, and I could not hum to you a single note of the one from Spectre. I don't even know who sang it.
It was Sam Smith, and it's terrible. I don't really like it. I don't remember what it's called. There was one of those things where he was doing interviews like, I wrote it in like 2 hours, but like he meant it as a brag, but it's like, yeah, we can tell. Like,
we know.
It doesn't sound like you spent a long time on it.
So now that No Time to Die, hopefully, fingers crossed, comes out in November, and that kind of ends this run of Bond films. I just want to ask, as we wrap this up, like, what do you want to see from Bond going forward? Like, what would you pick out from this? You're like, keep that, get rid of this, bring back that, don't do that. What are your kind of takeaways from this 5-run stretch?
There are 2 franchises that I would really like to see go back and become period franchises, and I know it's not going to happen because modern audiences don't want it. One would be Fantastic Four. I've had this argument with Hector Navarro several times because he really wants to do a modern-day Fantastic Four. To me, they make sense primarily in a Cold War context, and I think that would be really cool for them. But mainly, I would love for a new James Bond to come in and just set it back in the heyday of James Bond. Like, there's no reason to not do a string of James Bond films that take place in the 60s and 70s. Like, that would be so cool. It would give you so many opportunities to, take some of these older Ian Fleming stories more at face value. You wouldn't have to constantly make it like, oh, it's a North Korean story now. Like, you wouldn't have to constantly do that. You could just be like, it's the Soviet Union. They're like, that's Bond's greatest nemesis, like Spectre, Blofeld, all that. But like, that's who he is. That's who he always was. And like, I would love that. And I feel like that also gets you out of, then you don't have to compete with Mission Impossible or Bourne in terms of like the surveillance and the satellites and the internet. And like, you can just go back to when the gadgets were gadgets, like it was like a mechanical shark versus this car that releases fireworks, like it was just like handmade practical stuff because that was the era. I would love, love, love that. That would be my ideal creatively, but I know it won't happen because modern audiences would be like, what's that? Why don't they just use their cell phones?
You know what? Ultimately, I think, having not obviously seen the 5th one, like, I will like this run. Looking back on the Craigs, I think they're overall very good. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, look, on a long enough timeline, I think every Bond actor had, a great one and probably some not so great ones.
I think Dalton went 2 for 2.
I'm still waiting for the James Bond Jr. adaptation.
Yeah.
Which was now that I used to watch that cartoon, and I always thought it was strange that he was James Bond's nephew, yet was a junior.
Was named James Bond Jr. It's like, so you've just assumed his name. Your parents did not name you James Bond Jr. That would be really strange.
Also, James Bond had so much unprotected sex that, like, it's not a stretch to think that he would have probably a couple James Bond Juniors out there.
Yeah, I'm curious as to the origin of that creative decision where they like, well, we can't say his dad was James Bond, or else, like, where is his dad? Why isn't his dad raising him? It's like, because he's James Bond. Of course he'd be an absentee father. What do you think? Like, like that would be perfectly reasonable. Like, yeah, my dad was James Bond. I met him twice.
I'm fine if, after this stretch of Craig movies, if they take just a little bit of a break, even though I didn't know the character, didn't really know any of the movies, I do remember that when GoldenEye came out, it was kind of after a lengthy absence and it felt like it really special, like James Bond is back. So maybe take a little bit of a little James Bond break after this one and see if people, kind of come at it with new, fresh eyes.
Yeah, the other thing I think would be interesting, and again, this is like, it'll never happen. The Broccolis have said they don't want to do this. It's their movies only. Bond is sort of perfect for like a streaming limited series. Like the books themselves are very episodic. Like a lot of what Fleming wrote were short stories where it'd be like Bond's in New York and he does this one thing. In fact, the final scene that we were talking about in Quantum of Solace, where he goes to tell the woman like, oh, this guy's not really your boyfriend, he's working for Quantum. That's based on a short story called Bond in New York, where that's his mission. He's got to go blow up this dude's alibi, tell the woman that he's with that he's using her. So yeah, I mean, I think you could do something really cool, like cast an actor and do like 6-hour-long like Bond mini adventures and throw it on, Netflix or HBO Max or something or whatever. I know they won't do it, but it does kind of lend itself to that. It would be an interesting way to mix it up rather than having every time you come out, you got to figure out this like huge globe-trotting 2.5 hour, massive Bond adventure.
And maybe that would have, had this Craig series been like a limited series, maybe that would have served Quantum of Solace better if it was one episode in this large narrative.
If Quantum of Solace was like the action-oriented part of this one season of TV, I think I would feel very different about it. But when you want to sell it as, here's the new James Bond movie, you get like one every 4 years, and here it is. It's like, it's really underwhelming from that perspective. Like, it doesn't stand on its own nearly like Casino Royale or Skyfall or GoldenEye or some of these really great modern adventures.
Well, what does stand the test of time is talking movies with you, Lon. I love talking movies with you. I'm sad that I can't pop my head over to the writer's room, but I'm glad we can pop in on Zoom. Where can the people find you to either agree with you and cheer you on to tell me I'm wrong or to disagree with you?
Find me on Twitter at LONS. That's the easiest and quickest place to find me. You can also, I write a newsletter about streaming TV shows. So if you like my thoughts on streaming, on television, on films, you can find me there, inside.com/streaming. That's where to sign up for that.
Yeah, definitely do that. I signed up. I read it every single morning. It's fresh in my inbox like a little email muffin. I like to eat my little streaming newsletter muffin every morning.
Treat for you. If you want, it's been all Tiger King news for weeks now. I'm desperate to not have to write about Joe Exotic.
As it should be. Thank you so much, Lon, for joining us, and thank you for listening. Next week, we are talking about 5 teenagers with attitude. That's right. Power Rangers coming up here. Hot Takes with Billy Biz, Season 3. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys next week.